Ahoy there folks, I'm Captain Benzie and welcome to another video for Eve Echoes. In today's video I'm going to be talking about stealth bombers. These ships are some of my absolute favourite ships in the Eve universe. I think they can be a lot of fun. I just think they have unfortunately fallen prey to some rather big issues in Eve Echoes. Ultimately, I think it is fair to say, though I don't like saying it and using words like this, that these ships are currently utter garbage. So in today's video, I'm going to be going over all of the math that I've been doing to showcase how bad these are and how we can fix them. So, hopefully you've got your math brain on. Things are going to be pretty hectic in this. I'm going to try and get the actual numbers on screen as much as possible so you can check my working. I will put workings somewhere like on my Discord as well that people can easily reference and check through, just to make sure that I'm not making this up or that I haven't made any mistakes. Essentially, what I want to do is get stealth bombers back to where they should be. These are supposed to be terrifying ships against battleships and larger, and they're just not in Eve Echoes. They're just really, really not. If you're familiar with Bombers Bar in Eve Online, you'll have seen what they can be, and looking at what they are in Eve Echoes is just a disappointing, pale comparison. Ultimately then, I think it's best we pretty much just jump straight into this one, but it has taken me a lot of effort to do this, so please hit like on the video. It really helps out the channel, and if you want to keep me doing what I'm doing, head across to Patreon or to Redbubble. You can pledge to support me on Patreon, you can buy some really cool exclusive merchandise on Redbubble, and that helps me keep doing this kind of brain-melting arithmetic. Anyway, with all that said and done then, let's jump straight in. Now, first of all, I think we need to set the scene. So I'm going to open up the fitting of this particular Hound 3. I am at 555 on every single skill with frigate in the name. I also have all missile skills, small, medium, and large, at 554, both operations and upgrade. So we're basing this on a pretty much maxed out Hound 3. Now, if we have a look at the Pith C-type large torpedo launchers here, we can have a look at their alpha. You can see the damage types and that are all here on screen now, along with the explosion velocity and the explosion radius. And that's kind of what we need to be looking at in regards to this one. If we're having a look at the standard cold damage profile here, you're looking at a total of 2,977 damage per Pith C-type large torpedo launcher. Over all four, my alpha is therefore 11,908. Now, this then goes with an explosion velocity of 71 meters per second and an explosion radius of 324 meters. Now, the testing I've done here, a big thank you to Drademore for his help with this as well, has been done with me using 3 Republic Fleet target painters, that'll be referenced in the math later on as well, alongside 2 ballistic control systems in the bottom here. I've just gone for Republic Fleet because they're all I had handy, and in the rigs, if we go across to these, this is 3 Warhead Califaction catalysts in order to increase our maximum possible alpha. I have done testing with these as well by swapping these out for flare catalysts and things like that. It's generally not worth it. I think the changes that need to happen to stealth bombers need to happen outside of the rigs, as we'll talk about as we go through this. Now again, this is going to get pretty math heavy. I'll try and keep the numbers on the screen, but just please don't expect any big flashy graphics or anything going on here other than the little bit of footage I might show in regards to like how the test etc. went. So, ultimately, let's run from the top then. As I said, the maximum alpha on this particular ship is achieved through double hot plus bombard mode, so activating both the ballistic control units and bombard mode. With 4 large C-type torpedoes, that gives us a total alpha of 12,992. That's the 3,248 times by 4, and that 3,248 is the alpha of each large C-type torpedo with 2 ballistic control units active. I then tested this against a Dominix with a signature radius of 360 meters. Now, the downside of bombard mode is its application penalties. Ultimately, that drops the application of these particular torpedoes to 35.5 meters per second explosion velocity, 647 meters for the explosion radius. So, with the 3 target painters, remembering that target painters do have a stacking penalty, ultimately means that if we put 3 target painters onto that Dominix with 360 meters signature radius, the first target painter blooms it to 490.5, the second one blooms it to 645 meters, and the third one blooms it to 778.52. So that third target painter does take us over the explosion radius of a Bombard mode large torpedo, 647 meters radius, remember. That means for most of the calculations that you'll see later, we can actually ignore explosion radius for the most part, but again, we'll come to that. So with 3 target painters, we get 100% of explosion radius application, and against a stationary target, we should theoretically get 100% explosion velocity application, right? Well, no, trick question. 0 meters per second is actually technically impossible to achieve due to how Eve's inertia works. You ultimately are always moving towards 0, the game will display it as 0, but you're technically like 99.99% recurring. Unfortunately, because of how math works, the fact that it's not a complete 0%, you're 99% of the way there, but there's still that little gap, means there are always discrepancies. But hey, I did a live fire with Drademore's Dominix. With Cold, I basically undocked and I just fired at him with him as stationary as he could be. Cold, the strikes did 7,063 damage. That was 7,063 for 4 Pith C-type large torpedoes, hitting without the ballistic control unit active and not in Bombard mode. Now in this case, when I put the 3 target painters on, then activated Bombard mode, that went up to 7,560, so double hot plus Bombard was 7,560 damage per volley. Now ultimately there, you've got that 12,992 alpha damage that we talked about, and only 7,560 of that is actually applied to the target. That's 58% application against a 3 target painter stationary Dominix. So what's going on there? Well, of course, the Dominix has cold resistances. In this case, Drademore has put a 30% electromagnetic rig on, plus we've got the other resistances from the Dominix as well, which we'll talk about later. Now, just to have a look at the setup here, the Dominix has 131,274 effective hit points cold. That's with no modules running, no armor hardeners or shield hardeners or anything like that. Now, that means that if we were to take that 131,274, divide it by the 7,560 damage per volley, that's 17.36, meaning 18 volleys, assuming that the Dominix is parked, cold, and the pilot is completely AFK. Now, that's 18 volleys under absolutely ideal circumstances, which of course is never going to happen. So if we assume that the Dominix was still cold, no active modules, but moving, the Dominix has a base speed of 131 meters per second. So obviously we're excluding bonuses from battleship command skills here, and just going on a guy who has bought a Dominix at Tech 9 with no skills applied whatsoever, and just undocked it. Now, there is a missile calculation formula in Eve that is basically damage is equal to D, and then multiplied by the minimum of either 1, signature radius over explosion radius, or signature radius over explosion radius multiplied by explosion velocity over target velocity, multiplied all of that together by the damage reduction factor. Now, DRF is 1 for torpedoes, and this is one hell of a complex looking piece of arithmetic, but for the most part it's actually pretty simple. What you actually just need to look at here is basically the 3 parts of it. Damage equals D, and then the minimum of either 1, obviously 1 assumes 100% application, that's against a target that is larger and slower than your missile explosion radius and velocity, or against basically the product here of the explosion radius versus signature radius, and explosion radius versus target explosion velocity versus target velocity. So you do the 3 calculations there, either 1 or explosion radius over signature radius, or the big complex looking one, and whichever one of those is the smallest is what you use for the missile damage application. There are missile damage application calculators online as well. I'll put a link to one in the description as well so you can check my math on this, but ultimately that is the formula just to showcase exactly how it works there. Now, if we take this means that in this instance, 1 obviously is the missile application 100%, the signature radius over explosion radius is 1.2, because the signature radius is larger than the explosion radius in this case. Remember, we have 3 target painters giving a signature radius of 778.52 meters over our application of 647 explosion radius. So the signature radius is bigger than the explosion radius, meaning that that's more than 100%, so we would go with the 1 in that case. And then the final complex bit of maths there totals out to 0.326. That's the explosion radius versus signature radius, and explosion radius versus target velocity. So you take the smallest of those, which is smallest out of 1, 1.2, and 0.326. It's the 0.326, right? Therefore, damage is equal to the baseline damage, which in this case was 12,993, multiply that by the 0.326 that we got from this calculation, and that gives us a total of 4,235.39. Therefore, we would expect to do 4,235.39 raw damage per volley to a Dominix moving at a basic flight velocity of 131 meters per second. Hopefully that makes sense. And obviously this is not including any resistances whatsoever, so let's calculate those. If we look at this particular Dominix, it's got resistances of 40% electromagnetic, 20% thermal, 46% kinetic, and 50% explosive. That's again because the electromagnetic has been enhanced with a single anti-EM resistance rig. Don't ask, ultimately there's a very specific reason this ship was fitted the way it was, but it doesn't overly matter. The point we're looking at here is that when you total all of those together, then divide it by 4, that is an average resistance of 39%. Now, this is the highest overall resistance on this ship. The armor resistances are lower than 39% average, and the hull resistances, of course, are 33% average. So we're going to use the 39% average as if it were representative of both shield, armor, and hull, which again does mean that my calculations are slightly more conservative, but hey, we're going to just work with this. Therefore, if we look at that original volley of 4,235.39 and 39% of that resisted, that means 61% of that damage gets through. 61% of 4,235.39 is 2,583.59. My goodness, my poor little notebook is just getting little smoking holes in it at this point. Please remember that this is just cold resistances. The addition of any resistance modules like adaptive armor hardeners or adaptive invulnerability fields are just going to make this situation worse. We're basing this on cold so that then we can magnify it later and it's not quite as incredibly powerful as it might originally seem. But we'll come back to that. So that's cold resistances. Remember, addition of any resistance mod would reduce this damage further. Now, let's calculate how many volleys to kill with this new damage number. So the Dominix had a total EHP of 131,274. If we divide that by the 2,583.59, that is a total of 50.81 volleys. 51 volleys in total, because you can't have a percentage of a volley in EVE. That means it was 18 volleys against a stationary Dominix, but it's now 51 against a moving one. How often do you see truly stationary targets? You don't, simply put. So ultimately, we can look at this and see that explosion velocity is absolutely the issue on Bombard mode, because remember, our signature radius is actually bigger than our explosion radius, therefore we can ignore that for the most part. The only thing that has changed in these two examples is that the Dominix has gone from 0 meters per second, theoretically, to 131 meters per second, and it's gone from needing 18 volleys to kill to 51. That is a massive change, and that is entirely due to the explosion velocity penalty on Bombard mode. So, let's have a look at this then. What if there were no explosion velocity penalty to Bombard mode? If we use the same equation as above, except now the explosion velocity is the 71 meters per second that is just the standard of a Pith C-type large torpedo, so there is no explosion velocity penalty on Bombard mode, the damage is still 12,993. We can ignore the first parts of that horrible damage calculation before, and we know that the last bit is going to be smallest. So we're now looking at a damage equal to 12,993 multiplied by the product of 778.52 over 647 multiplied by 71 over 131 multiplied by 1. we've changed the previous calculation there with the previous explosion velocity of 35.5. It's now using the new explosion velocity, the basic explosion velocity without the penalty, of 71 meters per second. That gives us a total factor of 0.652, which is a considerable improvement over the factor we had before, which was 0.326. This means that when we multiply this out, we get a total raw damage now per strike of 8,471.436. Now again, we need to reduce that by 39% for resistances, so 8,571 times by 61% is 5,228.58. That's already a lot nicer on the damage against a very slowly moving Dominix. This, when we multiply it, divide that from the EHP of the Dominix, 131,274, divided by 5,228.58 is now 25.1. which is 26 volleys. So by taking off the explosion velocity penalty from Bombard mode has changed it from 51 volleys to kill down to 26 volleys to kill. This does mean that a moving Dominix has still gone from the stationary Dominix needed only 18 volleys to kill, now it needs that 26 volleys to kill. So moving still gives it some survivability, right? We're understanding, okay? That's better. But I would argue that this is still way too many volleys. If you're at all familiar with Bomber's Bar, as I mentioned earlier, you'll have seen small fleets of bombers alphaing battleships off-grid near instantly. They uncloak, they lock a target, they just blow it up, and then they warp off quickly to safety, assuming that they've killed that one target. Now, if we removed that explosion velocity penalty, we would need 26 fully fitted and skilled Tech 10 stealth bombers to achieve this, versus a completely naked and lower skilled Tech 9 battleship. You see the problems here. Already, this is just a lot of very powerful ships to take out one not so high level ship. So, what if Bombard mode actually buffed explosion velocity? Well, okay, now this is where things get tricky, because it would ultimately end up applying much better to smaller and faster targets like battle cruisers, which is not ideal. We want the bombers to be terrifying to battleships, not to just alpha any ship they find. As such, I would be reluctant to touch explosion velocity other than to remove the penalty. Removing the penalty helps it to hit battleships. Increasing the explosion velocity, actually making it faster than its basic value, would make this actually more powerful against faster ships like battle cruisers, and that's not what we're aiming to do, so I don't want to touch explosion velocity. So, what we can then do instead is look at the damage offered by Bombard mode and tweak that. Now, if Bombard mode were 10 times as good, we'd need approximately 10 times fewer ships, right? Well, no, sort of. It's a bit more complex due to the calculations already having that built-in 20% damage bonus. So, let's look at everything if we take that 20% damage bonus off. And crikey, I hope your head has not exploded at this point. I had to stop for coffee and come back a little bit later at this. So, what we're going to do now is use the damage profile of the torpedoes without Bombard mode. So what does a torpedo look like damage-wise without Bombard mode? But then we're going to use the application, the explosion velocity and explosion radius of Bombard mode, but with the explosion velocity penalty removed. So we're basically using the explosion velocity and the damage of a standard torpedo, but we're going to use the penalty to explosion radius for Bombard mode, right? So the concept here is that this is, again, going to hurt it if it is going to try and shoot at smaller, faster ships, but it is going to be scary and improve it against battleships, assuming we're using target painters. Hopefully, you're still with me. Okay, so without Bombard mode, the cold damage profile is 79, 581, 581, and 1016. That's a total of 2,977. When you multiply that across the 4 launches, that is 11,908. Therefore, if we take the damage of 11,908 and multiply it by that same application penalty we saw before, which was 0.652, remember, we haven't changed our application, we've only changed the damage, that is now a total of 7,764.016. Again, we still need to apply that 39% resists. That gives us a total of 4,736.05. Take the Dominic's EHP of 131,274, divide that by 4736, and that gives us a total of 27.7 or 28 volleys to kill. Okay, so now we're getting somewhere. What we now have is how many bombers it would take if Bombard mode did not apply a penalty to explosion velocity, if it did apply a penalty to explosion radius, and if it did not boost up the damage. So we can see in this situation, if we wanted 10 bombers to destroy this Dominic's in one volley, we would then need to increase the damage by a factor of 2.8, right? Because 28 volleys divided by 10 bombers is 2.8. Therefore, Bombard mode would need a 280% increase, a plus 280% damage bonus applied to it. Now, for neatness, and again, considering that this is all based on one Dominic's moving at incredibly slow speed with no resistances and skills and that applied to it, I'd actually put that up to plus 300%, just to round things out and help smooth out the maths and, account for the assumptions that we've made throughout this video so far. So, to balance this back out, however, I'd actually have the Bombard mode do similar to a shield field module and massively increase the user's signature radius too. Now let's use that same mathematically ridiculous plus 5,000% signature radius penalty. So after all of this now applied, Bombard mode now looks like plus 300% missile damage, plus 300% missile range, plus 100% explosion radius, which remember is a negative, minus 95% flight velocity, and plus 5,000% signature radius. What has that done to our stealth bomber? Essentially, what you now have is a ship that is terrifying to battleships when it is in Bombard mode, and in enough numbers, they're terrifying to capitals too, whilst also being incredibly easy to punish by anyone else nearby. For example, a single cruiser next to that battleship will near instantly lock and alpha a stealth bomber. A stealth bomber has less than 4,000 HP as standard. By the time you've even added on frigate defense, these are very easy to one-shot for most weapon systems. The concept is that if you uncloaked 10 stealth bombers and launched a volley at a battleship, you should probably take that battleship out in one go, or near as heck too. If you don't take out that battleship in one volley, it is going to have locked back multiple of your bombers, and even battleship turrets and missiles are still going to be able to apply damage surprisingly well to a stationary, massive signature radius stealth bomber and remove it from the grid in a single hit. The concept is that stealth bombers want to hit something and then flee rather than stick around. The second that they uncloak, something can lock onto them and kill them. You're going to be able to punish fleets of these really easily. And I know that some folks are sitting there saying, hang on a second, Benzie, what you're saying is that my ratting battleship is going to have 10 people appear in local and then I'm just going to disappear? And yes, that is kind of the point. This is nullsec. That's how things work. Nullsec is supposed to be very, very dangerous. Just be glad that in EVE Online, we have things like smart bombs. There is nothing quite like going through highsec, jumping through a gate, and just getting smart bombed into oblivion by a battleship sitting on that gate that saw you coming. We don't have that in EVE Echoes. What we do have, in this case, would be stealth bombers that provide a very large threat to any battleship that wants to basically go completely AFK. If you spot 10 people spiking in local, or if your friends tell you that there are 10 stealth bombers moving down the pipe towards your particular system, you might want to consider docking up. Ultimately, the point is that these changes would give a useful yet counterable ship. Stealth bombers would become terrifying against battleships and larger, pretty much useless against anything battlecruiser or smaller. Definitely anything faster than a battleship is going to really struggle against this. And they're counterable. That is the key point here, that if a stealth bomber does not kill the target that it's aiming at, or it does not kill everything on the grid rather, it is very easy to literally lock on and take off that stealth bomber before it can flee to safety, no matter what ship you're in. The ability to alpha a stealth bomber is not a difficult thing, and with a 5,000% increase to signature radius and a 95% reduction to flight velocity, they are relatively easy to lock, catch, and shoot at whilst they are trying to get to safety. Anyway, folks, those are my thoughts and opinions on this. I know this has been an incredibly math-heavy video. Some people have said they really like it when I go into this kind of detail. This one, as I said, utterly baked my noodle running all of this maths, but hopefully it's paid off. Hopefully this gives you an idea of what stealth bombers in EVE Echoes could be. And perhaps if you agree with this, you might want to poke the devs with it and say, yes, actually, this is good. Do come across to the Cat Skull Academy Discord. I will have this math posted up there for folks to be able, or DM me on Discord or whatever, and I will send you the file here. You can check my maths, you can check my numbers, and you might find some issues with this, and you might find some problems with it. When I was sort of beta testing this and running the numbers a couple of weeks back, I sent it across to Nina, who immediately pointed out that some of the changes I'd made it ridiculous against battle cruisers. I could take out hurricanes with the fit, which was not intended. So I went back through the numbers, I changed the missile velocity and things like that, so that those are not going to suddenly be able to we're not going to suddenly be able to target battle cruisers. We are very much intending our targets to be battleships and larger. Anyway, let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comment section down below. Would love to hear what you guys think about this one. Otherwise, happy sailing and see you in New Eden.